The Battle of Bunker Hill was a battle fought between the Americans and the British on June 17, 1775. But before we talk about the Battle of Bunker Hill, I'd like to give us a quick review that led to the battle. Just 2 months before, Paul Revere told the American troops that the British were coming, resulting in the battles of Lexington and Concord. Right after the battle, 15,000 American troops encircled the town of Boston, hoping to besiege it, but due to British naval superiority, the British simply resupplied their troops by sea. The Americans decided to come up with a new plan, where instead of starving the town out, they would bombard it using artillery. And after some consideration, they decided that Charleston Peninsula would be the place to do it, and it will be led by Colonel William Prescott. The night before the battle was fought, Prescott, under the coat of night, sent 1,200 American troops to take the peninsula and start building fortifications for the artillery. Prescott was at first planning on building artillery at Bunker Hill, but decided that Breed's Hill, since it was closer to the city of Boston, so he ordered his fortifications to be built there instead. While the Americans were still building fortifications, the British ship HMS Lively realized what the Americans were doing and opened fire on the fortifications, but, ironically, Samuel Graves, the admiral at the time, stopped the ship from continuing firing after being woke up, not understanding what was happening until morning, allowing the Americans to have an easier time building fortifications. Prescott asked for more troops and received 200 soldiers who were led by Colonel John Stark and James Reed. The British were debating on how they should deal with the Americans. General Clinton believed that attacking the entrance of the peninsula would be best due to it trapping the Americans, and the British could starve them out, but all of the other generals were against the idea. The generals believed that it would lead troops to be sucked between the Americans, making them surrounded. In the end, they decided a frontal attack would be better. General Clinton sent 1,500 British troops to the peninsula, led by General Howe and General Piggott. General Cowie's plan was to attack the flank of the American troops to encircle Breed's Hill. They thought that since the Americans were low in supply and ammo, and they had a lack of organization, with barely any of them ever seen combat in their lives, the British believed that this would be an easy battle. Before the British started the attack, they had to go through waist-high wheat and get over fences, slowing their advances and tiring them out. And due to it being in the middle of summer, many of them suffered from heat exhaustion. When the Americans and British first met in battle, the Americans were commanded to hold their fire until the British were around 50 paces away, with one American general saying not to fire until they saw the whites in their eyes. Americans were able to use their defenses to be able to prevent being shot at and were able to return fire at better accuracy, due to them being still. In the end, the British took significant casualties during the first charge against the Americans, and they were forced to retreat to the field to regroup. After the failed attack, General Piggott decided that the best course of action would be a much more direct assault at the redoubt of the Americans' fortifications, while General Howe would attack James Reed's positions of defenses. But just like the previous attack, this one went just as terribly, with no gain being made. The Americans, despite their lack of training and the lack of equipment, was able to hold back the British for the second time. But several problems for the Americans started to arise. William Prescott failed on sending reinforcements from Bunker Hill to Breed's Hill. What made it worse was that many Americans were starting to retreat from Breed's Hill, and in the end, by the third assault, there was only 800 men left and 200 in the redoubt. The British army was in complete disarray, but Howe still committed to a third attack. This time, he decided a more centralized attack on the redoubt, hoping to overwhelm the Americans. General Clinton, realizing just how dire the situation has got, sent 400 more troops to help with Howe with this third assault. Howe had learned from his previous mistakes by 1. Making it where his troops would march in a column formation instead of line, making the troops more compact instead of being spread out. He also forced them to drop any unnecessary equipment to make them to be able to go up the hill easier. The Americans were now out of ammo, so lost their main advantage. With the British getting close enough, they got their bayonets and charged the Americans. The Americans were less skilled, and most of them didn't even have melee weapons to counter the British, so they were quickly overwhelmed by the British army. The Americans quickly retreated, with Colonel Prescott, being the man that he was, being the last one to lead the fortification, fighting the British with a saber, which sounds like something you'd hear out of a movie. Spark and Noaton was able to get the majority of the American troops to successfully retreat, with many of the wounded even being able to make it out. Prescott tried to get the troops to reform at Bunker Hill, but the army was at that point at full retreat, leaving the cannons to be taken by the British. The British would win the battle, Charleston Peninsula, but at a terrible cost. While the Americans only lost 140 soldiers with 310 wounded, the British lost 226 men and took more than twice the amount of wounded than the Americans. In fact, when Clinton heard of the British victory at Bunker Hill, he himself famously said, "A few more such victories would have shortly put an end to British domination of America, capping off of Pius of Epirus after his victory against the Romans." After the battle, the British troops quickly fortified the peninsula so that the Americans wouldn't be able to retake it, and the siege of Boston would continue for another year until American troops were able to deliver heavy enough artillery from Ticonderoga to bomb the British out. In the end, after a year, the British were forced to retreat, allowing the Americans to take the town. This battle will make the British realize that the American army was not just some angry peasant mob, but a legitimate threat, with them rethinking how they would fight. The British would start taking a much more cautious approach when they were fighting against the Americans, with the Americans taking advantage of this several times, saving them way more times than it would have the British. This battle would show the American defiance against the British, but the American Revolution War would continue on with many future battles to wait for the Americans.